The grand church was silent, save for the soft echo of the organ playing a mournful hymn. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns over the polished wooden pews, each one filled with the city's wealthiest and most influential people. They had all come to pay their respects to Eleanor Whitmore, the formidable matriarch of the Whitmore family, a woman known for her sharp mind, her ruthless business acumen, and, in rare moments, her unexpected kindness. At the very back of the church, hidden in the shadows of the last pew, sat a small, thin girl in a faded black dress. Her name was Lila, and she clutched a wrinkled handkerchief in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. No one had greeted her when she slipped inside. No one had offered her a seat among the family. To the Whitmores and their elite guests, she was invisible, just another orphan, a nobody. But Eleanor had seen her. For years, when the world had turned its back on Lila, Mrs. Whitmore had been the one to quietly leave a warm meal by the orphanage. Gates, to slip a book into her hands with a whispered, "You deserve more than this, child." She had been the only one who ever looked at Lila and saw something beyond the tattered clothes and hollow cheeks. Now, Eleanor was gone, and Lila was alone again. At the front of the church, Eleanor's son, Richard, stood with his perfect family. His elegant wife, Victoria, and their spoiled daughter, Clarissa, who kept shooting disdainful glances around the room as if even grief was beneath her. They had never approved of Eleanor's soft spot for the orphan girl. To them, Lila was nothing more than a charity case, a stain on their polished reputation. What they didn't know was that Eleanor had left behind more than just memories. Hidden in the lawyer's briefcase was a will, one that would change everything. The air inside the church was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the faint, lingering aroma of candle wax, a stark contrast to the cold indifference that hung over the Whitmore family as they pretended to mourn. The priest's voice droned on, his words about Eleanor's generosity and kindness ringing hollow in Lila's ears. She kept her head bowed, her fingers twisting the frayed edges of her dress, trying to make herself even smaller, even more invisible. She didn't belong here, not in this world of silk dresses and polished shoes, where grief was measured in the weight of gold cufflinks and the size of floral arrangements. But she had come anyway, because Eleanor had been the only person who ever made her feel like she mattered. Across the aisle, Richard Whitmore adjusted his tie, his expression carefully composed into something resembling sorrow, though his eyes were as cold as the marble floors beneath their feet. His wife, Victoria, sat rigidly beside him, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line. Every so often, she would lean over and whisper something to their daughter, Clarissa, who would then glance around the church with a bored expression, as if the entire funeral were an inconvenience. When her gaze landed on Lila, her nose wrinkled, slightly, as though she had caught a whiff of something unpleasant. Lila shrank back, her cheeks burning with shame. She knew what they thought of her. Beggar, stray, charity case. She had heard the words hissed under their breath whenever Eleanor had allowed her into the house for a warm meal. But Eleanor had never cared about their disapproval. She had always welcomed Lila with a gentle smile, a warm hand on her shoulder, a quiet word of encouragement. "You are worth more than they will ever understand," she had once told her, her voice firm, her eyes holding a secret that Lila couldn't decipher. Now, with Eleanor gone, Lila felt that loss like a physical ache, a hollow space in her chest that she knew would never be filled. The priest's final prayer faded into silence, and the mourners began to rise, their murmurs filling the church. As they prepared to leave, Lila stayed where she was, unsure if she should follow, unsure if she would even be allowed to. Then a hand touched her shoulder. She flinched, looking up to see an elderly man in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. "Miss Lila?" he asked, his voice low. "My name is Mr. Thorne. I was Mrs. Whitmore's attorney. She left specific instructions regarding you." Lila's breath caught in her throat. Around them, the Whitmore family had begun to file out of the church, their expensive shoes clicking against the floor, their voices hushed but sharp with impatience. None of them noticed her. None of them cared. But Mr. Thorne's grip on her shoulder tightened slightly, as if he understood the storm that was about to come. "You should come with me," he said quietly. "There's something you need to hear." And, just like that, Lila knew. Whatever was coming next would change everything. The murmur of the departing crowd faded into the distance as Lila followed Mr. Thorne through a side door of the church, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the entire congregation could hear it. The hallway they entered was dimly lit, the walls lined with portraits of solemn-faced men and women who seemed to watch her with disapproving eyes, as though questioning her right to be there. The weight of their painted gazes made her shoulders hunch instinctively, her fingers knotting into the fabric of her dress. She had spent her entire life being told she didn't belong, in the orphanage, on the streets, and especially in the world of the Whitmores. Yet here she was, trailing behind a lawyer who spoke of instructions as if Eleanor had left behind some grand plan just for her. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Mr. Thorne led her into a small, wood-paneled office, the kind reserved for private meetings and hushed conversations. A single window let in a sliver of gray afternoon light, casting long shadows across the heavy desk that dominated the room. On its surface lay a folder, crisp and unassuming, but Lila's eyes locked onto it as though it were a coiled serpent. She didn't need to ask what it contained. The will. The document that would decide who inherited Eleanor's vast fortune, her sprawling estates, her power. The idea that her name might be written somewhere in those pages was absurd. Impossible. And yet, the way Mr. Thorne hesitated before speaking, the careful way he avoided her gaze, told her that the impossible was exactly what was about to happen. He cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitmore was a woman of strong convictions, he began, his voice measured. She believed in justice, in fairness. Lila barely dared to breathe, and she was deeply troubled by the way certain members of her family conducted themselves. A flicker of understanding sparked in Lila's chest. She remembered the way Richard would sneer when Eleanor handed her a book, the way Victoria would, accidentally, bump into her when passing in the hallway, the way Clarissa would whisper "beggar" under her breath just loud enough for her to hear. Eleanor had seen it all, and Eleanor, it seemed, had not forgotten. Mr. Thorne opened the folder. "Her will is unconventional." He paused as if bracing himself. "She has left the majority of her estate, the primary residence, the shares in Whitmore Industries, the bulk of her financial assets, to you, Lila." The words hung in the air, sharp and unbelievable. Lila's knees buckled. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself, her mind reeling. This wasn't just money. This was power. This was revenge served on a silver platter, a chance to make the Whitmores feel as small as they'd made her feel. But beneath the shock, beneath the dizzying rush of triumph, something colder stirred. Because Eleanor hadn't just given her wealth, she'd given her a choice, and the Whitmores would be waiting. The silence in the small office was suffocating, pressing against Lila's eardrums like a physical force as Mr. Thorne's words settled over her. She stared at the open folder on the desk, the crisp legal documents with their dense blocks of text and flourished signatures, unable to reconcile their contents with the reality of her life. She had spent years sleeping on threadbare cots in the orphanage, shivering through winters with only a thin blanket for warmth, scrounging for scraps of food when the matrons forgot, or chose, to feed her. The idea that she now owned the Whitmore estate, the sprawling mansion with its marble floors and gilded chandeliers, the vaults filled with jewels and art and generations of wealth, was so ludicrous that a hysterical laugh bubbled up in her throat. She swallowed it down, her fingers trembling as she reached out, hesitating just above the paper as if touching it might make it dissolve into smoke. Mr. Thorne watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. "There are conditions," he said, and the weight in his voice made her stomach clench. Of course there were. Nothing in her life had ever been simple, ever been freely given. Mrs. Whitmore stipulated that you must live in the main house for 1 full year before the inheritance is irrevocably yours. If you leave before that time, the estate reverts to Richard. Lila's breath caught. Live in that house? With them? The thought of facing Richard's icy disdain, Victoria's razor-sharp smiles, Clarissa's cruel whispers day after day for a year made her skin crawl. But beneath the fear, something hotter flickered. Eleanor hadn't just handed her the keys to the kingdom. She'd handed her a weapon. "There's more," Mr. Thorne continued, pulling a sealed envelope from the folder. "This is for you. Mrs. Whitmore insisted you read it alone." He held it out, and Lila took it with numb fingers, the paper thick and expensive under her calloused fingertips. Her name was written on the front in Eleanor's elegant script, the ink slightly smudged as if the older woman's hand had trembled while writing it. The sight sent a pang through her chest. How long ago had Eleanor known she was dying? How long had she planned this? A sharp knock at the office door shattered the moment. Before Mr. Thorne could respond, the door swung open, and Richard Whitmore strode in, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood. His face was a mask of practiced calm, but his eyes, cold and calculating, darted immediately to the folder, on the desk, then to Lila, lingering on the envelope in her hands. "Ah," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Here you are. We've been looking everywhere for you, Mr. Thorne. The reading of the will is about to begin." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "And Lila, what a surprise to see you here. I wasn't aware you were involved in family matters." The unspoken words hung in the air between them. "You don't belong here." Lila straightened her shoulders, clutching the envelope tighter. "I was invited," she said, and the steadiness of her own voice surprised her. Richard's smile twisted. "How curious." He turned to Mr. Thorne. "Shall we?" As they left the office, Lila trailing behind, she could feel the storm gathering around her. The Whitmores had no idea what was coming, and she had no idea if she was ready for it. The grand hall of the Whitmore estate had never felt more suffocating than it did in that moment, with the heavy velvet drapes drawn tight against the afternoon sun, and the air thick with the cloying scent of lilies arranged in ostentatious vases around the room. Lila hovered near the doorway, her back pressed against the wall as if she could somehow merge with the shadows and disappear entirely. The family had gathered around the long mahogany table where Mr. Thorne now stood, his hands resting atop the dreaded folder, his expression unreadable. Richard sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his fingers steepled in front of him as though he were already presiding over a board meeting rather than the dissolution of his mother's legacy. Victoria perched beside him, her spine straight, her lips pursed in a way that suggested she was already calculating how to spin whatever came next to her advantage. Clarissa, draped in black lace that cost more than Lila had ever seen in her life, twirled a strand of hair around, her finger, her boredom palpable. Lila's stomach twisted as Mr. Thorne cleared his throat and began to read. The legal jargon washed over her in waves, meaningless until he reached the heart of it, the distribution of assets. Richard's name came first, but the sum he was allotted was laughably small, a pittance compared to what he had expected. His face darkened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. Victoria's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. Clarissa's bored expression finally cracked, her eyes widening in disbelief as the numbers piled up. Or, rather, failed to. And then Mr. Thorne said Lila's name. The room erupted. Richard was on his feet in an instant, his chair screeching backward. "This is absurd," he spat, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Some street rat my mother took pity on? You expect us to believe she left everything to her?" His glare swung toward Lila, and for the first time in her life, she saw something like fear in his eyes, fear of her, of what she now held over him. Victoria's voice was colder, more dangerous. "There must be some mistake," she said, her nails tapping against the table. "Eleanor would never—" "There is no mistake," Mr. Thorne interrupted, his tone firm. "The will has been verified. The conditions are clear." He turned to Lila, who felt suddenly like a rabbit caught in a snare. "Lila inherits the primary estate, the majority shares in Whitmore Industries, and the bulk of Mrs. Whitmore's liquid assets. However—" He paused, and the room held its breath. "She must reside in the estate for 1 full year. If she leaves before that time, the inheritance reverts to Richard." A slow, cruel smile spread across Richard's face. "Ah," he said softly. "So there's a catch." His eyes locked onto Lila's, and she knew, with a sinking certainty, what he was thinking. She would never last a year under his roof, not when he could make every second of it a living hell. Clarissa's laugh was high and brittle. "Well," she drawled, "this should be entertaining." Lila's fingers tightened around Eleanor's letter, still unopened in her pocket. She had no idea what game she had just been thrust into, only that she was now a player, whether she wanted to be or not, and the Whitmores would do everything in their power to make sure she lost. The weight of the unopened letter burned in Lila's pocket as she stood frozen in the doorway of the Whitmore library, her breath coming in shallow gasps that fogged the chilled air. The room smelled of leather and dust, of old money and older secrets, the kind that clung to the spines of the first-edition books lining the walls like silent witnesses to generations of family drama. Outside, rain lashed against the leaded windows with a fury that matched the storm raging inside her chest. She could still hear Richard's voice echoing through the grand hallway. "This isn't over," the words slithering under the door like poison seeping through cracks. Her fingers trembled as she finally pulled the envelope from her pocket, the paper whispering against her rough fingertips. The wax seal, Eleanor's personal crest, a phoenix rising from flames, cracked with a sound like breaking bones. Inside, the handwriting was unmistakable, those elegant loops and sharp angles she'd seen 100 times in the margins of borrowed books. "My dear Lila," it began, and just like that, the dam broke. Hot tears blurred the words as Eleanor's voice seemed to rise from the page, wrapping around her like the woman's favorite cashmere shawl. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and they've told you what I've done. Forgive an old woman her final act of meddling, but some lessons must be learned the hard way." Lila's breath hitched. "You'll wonder why. The truth is, I saw myself in you. Not the girl I was, but the woman I might have been, had I not been born with a silver spoon in my mouth. Richard and Victoria. They've never known hunger, real hunger. Not for food, nor for love. But you have, and that makes you stronger than they'll ever be." A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Lila stiffened, hastily wiping her eyes, but the footsteps passed. She exhaled and kept reading. "The house is yours, but the real inheritance is what you'll find in the East Wing, behind the portrait of my grandfather. There's a safe. The combination is your birthday. What's inside will explain everything. But be careful, child. Some secrets are dangerous." The letter ended abruptly, as if Eleanor had been interrupted mid-thought. Lila turned it over, searching for more, but there was only one final line. "Remember, phoenixes rise, but first they must burn." A crash from downstairs shattered the silence. Raised voices. Richard's, thick with drink, Victoria's sharp as broken glass. Something heavy toppled over with a thud that vibrated through the floorboards. Lila stuffed the letter back in her pocket, her pulse hammering. The East Wing, the portrait, the safe. And then, from right outside the door, a soft, mocking laugh. "Lost, little orphan?" Clarissa's voice dripped honeyed venom. This isn't your house yet." The doorknob began to turn. The moment stretched like a wire about to snap as Lila's eyes darted from the turning doorknob to the towering bookshelves around her. With a sudden burst of movement, she grabbed a heavy volume of Shakespeare from the nearest shelf and let it fall open on the desk just as Clarissa's perfectly coiffed head appeared in the doorway. The girl's sharp eyes swept the room, lingering on Lila's tear-streaked face before dropping to the book with mocking amusement. "Studying tragedy, are we?" she purred, stepping inside with the predatory grace of a cat circling its prey. "How fitting." Lila willed her voice steady. Eleanor loved Shakespeare. The words tasted like ashes, but they made Clarissa pause, her manicured fingers twitching at her side. Even now, even for her, speaking ill of the dead was a line not easily crossed. The hesitation gave Lila the opening she needed. "I was just leaving." She slid the letter deeper into her pocket as she stood, the movement casual, but Clarissa's gaze followed it like a hawk spotting movement in the grass. "What's that?" The question came too quickly, too sharply. "Nothing." Lila edged toward the door, but Clarissa blocked her path, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "You always were a terrible liar." In one fluid motion she snatched at Lila's pocket. The fabric tore with a sickening rip, and the letter fluttered to the floor between them. For a heartbeat they both stared at it. The broken seal, Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting. Then Clarissa lunged. What happened next was a blur of grabbing hands and tearing paper, of Lila's elbow accidentally connecting with Clarissa's jaw, of the girl's shriek of outrage as she stumbled back into a side table, sending a Ming vase crashing to the floor. The sound brought running footsteps, heavy, angry. Richard appeared in the doorway, his face purpling with rage as he took in the scene, his daughter clutching her cheek, the shattered heirloom, and Lila standing over the torn remnants of Eleanor's final words. "You," he breathed, the word thick, with loathing. "You vicious little—" "Richard." Victoria's voice cut through the tension like a scalpel. She stood behind him, her face a mask of icy calm, but her eyes burned with something darker. "Not here." Her gaze flicked meaningfully toward the ceiling, toward where the lawyers and executors still lingered upstairs. "Later." The unspoken threat hung in the air as Lila backed away, her fingers closing around the largest piece of the torn letter still legible. East Wing and portrait and safe. She fled before they could stop her, her shoes slipping on the polished marble as she turned down corridor after corridor, the house seeming to breathe around her, its shadows stretching and twisting like living things. The East Wing was darker, dustier, frozen in time. Eleanor's grandfather's portrait loomed over a cobwebbed alcove, his stern eyes following her as she reached behind the heavy frame. The click of the hidden safe mechanism was louder than a gunshot in the silent house. Inside lay a single yellowed envelope, and inside that, Lila's knees gave out. The birth certificate trembled in her hands. Mother, Eleanor Whitmore. Father, unknown. And there, in careful script, baby girl, Lila Marie. The world tilted. Memories reshaped themselves, Eleanor's lingering. Touches, the way she'd always seemed to find Lila no matter which orphanage they moved her to. The books she'd chosen just for her. Not charity. Not kindness. Guilt. A floorboard creaked behind her. Lila turned, the truth like a weight in her chest, just as Richard stepped from the shadows, a revolver glinting dully in his hand. "I always wondered," he murmured, "why Mother cared so much about some filthy orphan." His smile was terrible. "Now I know." The gun rose. "And Lila." Lila laughed. The sound startled him, his finger freezing on the trigger. "You don't understand," she whispered, clutching the birth certificate to her chest. "She didn't leave me the money because she loved me." Her voice broke. "She left it because she was ashamed of me. ashamed of herself. For the first time, Richard hesitated. Outside, sirens wailed. Mr. Thorne, it seemed, had believed Eleanor's warnings about her son more than Lila had. As the police burst in, as Richard swore and Victoria screamed, Lila sat very still amidst the ruins of the Whitmore legacy, the truth heavy in her hands. The money meant nothing. The name meant nothing. But the choice. To walk away, to burn it all down, or to rise from the ashes, that was hers alone. And as the first light of dawn crept through the stained glass windows, painting the wreckage in shades of gold and crimson, Lila Marie Whitmore stood.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.